Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. For those of you who are just joining us, we're going to get started here in a few seconds. We're really glad you're here. We're really glad you're here. For those of you who are just joining us, my name is Chris Kerr, Executive Director of the Ignatian Solidarity Network, and we're excited to have you be a part of this special workshop today on being a voice for justice amid the realities of social distancing. Just to give you a quick overview of our format, we're going to have some large group presentations here. You'll see on the right-hand side of your screen is the schedule, all right? And we're going to work our way through that schedule. That schedule is in Eastern time, so if you're in Central, Mountain, or Pacific time, just do the appropriate deduction of 1, 2, or 3 hours from those times. And you'll see that around 3:50, we're going to break out into some breakout groups, and we're going to use Zoom for those breakout groups. And I've seen that many of you have already logged into Zoom. And what will happen is we'll while the presenters are talking, we'll actually be putting you into your breakout groups so that when we get to 3:50 Eastern time, you'll have the chance to begin those discussions. Those breakout groups are set up for you to be able to talk with folks from in some cases, your city, in some cases, your state, in some cases, your region, depending on how many people kind of are participating from that area of the country. So you'll see that your group is kind of titled in a way that gives you a sense of how you'll be broken up, but it'll be a chance to talk with people about some of what you learned today, about issues that you're facing in your community. And I'll go over the breakout groups really quickly at the end of our kind of presentation portion of the session. So this is intended to be kind of a workshop, not only kind of one directional, you getting to hear from others, but also getting a chance to talk with people and engage in conversation about ways of living out the commitment of this idea of being a voice for justice amid social distancing. I want to be very clear, we do not have all the answers here today. We hope that this provides some sustenance for the journey, some skills, some knowledge, some maybe motivation to stand up for the rights and dignity of those around us. But we won't answer every question. We hope this can be the first step, maybe in engaging with us moving forward, and that we might do something else like this in the future, but I'm excited to kind of start that conversation. We are going to place some resources down at the bottom of the page. Some of those will come from our presenters today. We've already put something there, and we'll make some other things available. So we're going to turn it over to our first presenter, who's Joseph Thomas McKellar, who's the co-director of Pico, California, and I'm going to welcome Joseph into the room. Joseph, how are you doing? It's good to see you. Thanks so much for being with us today. Joseph, we're going to kind of do a little bit of a Q&A, or we'll just kind of get you started, and you feel free to kind of go, and talk as you will. But what I was hoping is you could start out, one, telling us a little bit about the history of Pico and Faith in Action, which of course has a long history of connection to the Jesuit Ignatian world and network founded by Father John Baumann, Pico anyway, founded by Father John Baumann, Jesuit originally of the California province, who still works with Pico International. So why don't you give us a little bit of the context of that history, and then maybe you can start to talk about the ways that Pico is walking with communities that are deeply impacted by the pandemic today. All right. I know you've got some slides. We're going to put those up here on the screen in a second. So feel free just to prompt me when you want to move from one slide to the next. Just say next slide, or can you go to this slide or that slide, and we'll get you what you need. All right. So I'm going to turn it over to you and welcome you to our gathering today and let you begin.
Sounds great. Great to be with you, Chris, and the Ignatian Solidarity Network. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to Annie Fox as well, who I don't see on my screen. Actually, I only see myself, which is a strange experience. I'm used to seeing lots of faces on Zoom calls lately. Right. But thank you to Annie from Jesuits West for also helping to make this happen and for the invitation. For those of you that are not familiar with Pico and Faith in Action, we are in California. Pico, California is the largest faith-based community organizing network in the state. We've been around for 20 years. We work with 10 affiliates, 10 member organizations that are a part of our faith-based organizing network that are doing faith-based organizing in 24 counties and over half of the state's Senate and state assembly districts. Those affiliates work with 500 congregations from different faith traditions, representing about 450,000 people. And we're really dedicated to this idea that our mission, our call is to create a new California of shared abundance by undoing structural racism and unleashing a powerful faith-rooted values-based voice for justice and peace. And we just deeply believe that all people belong and that part of our job is to change systems and policies that ultimately widen the circle of human concern. We're part of the national network called Faith in Action that was founded by Father John Bauman almost 50 years ago. Father John is a Jesuit priest based in Oakland. I got connected to Faith in Action, what was then Pico National, through my work as a Jesuit volunteer in Boston in 2004 and 2005. Grew up myself in a very kind of spiritually and culturally Mexican Catholic family, and am called to the work of justice and peace very much through my own Catholic faith and sense of vocation to walk with and for the excluded and marginalized amongst us, many of whom are in my own family. And so the work is deeply personal and it's deeply spiritual. And yeah, that's a bit of background, I think, on me and Pico.
That's great. Thanks. Thanks, Joseph. And why don't you tell us a little about the ways that right now Pico, California is walking with communities who are deeply impacted by the pandemic? What are the stories and concerns you're hearing from the ground, and how are communities responding? I know there's work happening around rent moratoriums, funding to support the needs of undocumented families, and other initiatives as well. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Absolutely. Yeah, and maybe I'll have you call up the PowerPoint there, Chris. So yeah, this is actually a map of our state network. I want to just start with a bit of an analysis around the notion that we believe this crisis, really this illness that is known as the coronavirus or COVID-19, is really exposing the many sicknesses that have plagued our communities for generations. Those who are suffering the most before this pandemic are those who are now struggling the most. And while there is kind of a universal sense of vulnerability in the moment, some of us are struggling more than others. And so I included a couple slides in here. Yeah, Chris, you can go to the next one. That includes some of our analysis around this kind of former paradigm before this pandemic. We believe that there are a set of historic policy choices made by people in positions of power that have resulted in segregation and exclusion of African Americans, Native folks, immigrants, formerly incarcerated people, and poor white people from the benefits that we believe should be available to everyone, from good housing to good jobs, good health, and democratic rights. And so part of what we're suggesting is that our collective health depends on people's ability, people specifically in positions of power, to see what is actually happening, understanding the root causes, and then proposing and implementing solutions that keep all people safe, regardless of skin color or immigration status or how much money we have. Go to the next slide. The other interesting thing happening is the whole notion of who is an essential worker is being redefined. We're learning that essential workers are not hedge fund managers. Essential workers are everyday folks in our congregations and our communities, in Jesuit works and ministries, who are taking care of others, people who are working in our grocery stores, teachers who are trying to keep kids engaged from physical distancing kind of limitations. And yet this pandemic has revealed that their labor is undercompensated, is not respected in the way it should be by us as a society. Many of those folks are uninsured, and the companies they work for withhold necessary safety and paid leave. And so part of, again, the values sort of belief we have through this is that when any one of us is barred from being able to prevent, detect, treat, or recover from this illness, all of us are at greater risk. And part of our hope, I'll say this at the end, but part of our hope is that collectively you all are helping us tell the story in a way that is expansive and generous, and that reminds us of our shared destiny and mutual dependence on one another for survival. Go to the next slide, Chris. So you'll see here, I'm going to just walk through a few slides that I think sort of lay out our organizing plan and our theory of change. But again, I want to root this in the belief that we have to be clear about our values and vision throughout this process of trying to create social change in the midst of this pandemic. We believe every human life is sacred. As I said earlier, we belong to each other and need one another to live healthy, thriving lives, and that every person without exception needs and deserves dignified, safe work, reliable income, and safe and affordable housing. And so our vision is really rooted in these 4 pillars: health for all, housing for all, full inclusion and reparations, and guaranteed wages, of which Pope Francis spoke of in a letter to popular movements on Easter Sunday, just a few weeks ago. And so you see, kind of branching out from each of these 4 pillars, some of our, what we call our God goals, the big systemic structural changes that we are hopeful are being accelerated through this crisis. You know, we say that history may not repeat itself, but history does rhyme. And if you look at other crises from our past, not just the kind of Great Depression that brought about the New Deal, but even other pandemics like the Black Plague that wiped out 1/3 of the world's population in the Middle Ages, that Black Plague, as bad as it was, brought about social progress. It was the end of serfdom in much of Europe. It brought about new worker protections. And we're hopeful again that some of these God goals, these big transformative changes, become more possible through our organizing around the immediate crisis now. Go to the next slide. So our organizing, again, we believe that as we clarify our vision, we also need to be clear about our analysis. Where are the kind of focal points, the points of leverage where decisions are being made and will continue to be made that directly affect the lives of the poor and excluded amongst us? And those are in a number of areas. And some of what I'm about to share is kind of California-centric, but the hope is that this framework can be applied wherever it is you find yourself in the country. So one of the focal points is the federal government. Another is kind of the private sector, particularly around financial industry and corporations that are receiving billions and billions of dollars of our public tax resources in the form of bailouts and stimulus packages. Our state legislatures, our state budgets, new revenue measures, and then local, that is city and county level legislation and budgets. Now, it's important to understand what are the powers available to each of these entities as we see it as it relates to this crisis. The federal government is the only entity that can print more money. None of our states can do that. And so the federal government has the ability, as it has been, to debt finance for the purposes of some of the immediate needs we're seeing, but also some of the big structural reforms we know are necessary, going back to the last slide. So the federal government matters. The financial industry and corporations have the ability to change the terms of mortgages that affect not just homeowners, but renters who rent from landlords who have mortgages. around job conditions. They can also be contributing more to our shared prosperity through taxes. Our state legislatures all over the country are going to be dealing with massive budget deficits. They can pass new revenue bills to help stem the impact of those budget deficits, knowing that historically deficits fall on the back of the poor and people of color disproportionately. State budgets are, through our state legislatures being negotiated right now. Those state budgets can pay for expanded health access, worker benefits, services. There's also discussion in California about new revenue in the form of a ballot measure that we are sponsoring called Schools and Communities First. That's what that SCF stands for on there. And the census, all of you hopefully are helping to get out the word about the census, which is a critical vehicle to ensure that people are counted, are seen in our communities, and that they in turn receive the federal and state and local resources that they deserve. And then lastly, but not least, local legislation, local bodies can issue new policies, redirect funds for community needs. Go to the next slide. And so we're really seeing our organizing is happening in kind of three phases. The first phase is relief. The second phase is recovery. And the third phase is something we're calling renewal. So relief, recovery, and renewal. And then you'll see on here kind of our broad sort of issue priorities, from expanding access to healthcare to ensuring housing is available to everyone, to income and wage and cash assistance and economic aid, to full inclusion and restoration for folks who are left out of stimulus packages, and then to a full participant democracy. You'll see in here, I won't go through it in detail, but on the slide, you'll see some of our ideas about kind of policy needs in the short relief period, the midterm recovery period, and the long-term renewal period. A couple of things we've already done in California. We've gotten a somewhat strong eviction moratorium, although it's not a rent freeze, and that is something we're pushing for right now, is to ensure that anyone who is accumulating debt to their landlords are not required to pay that back, because we know people who rent can't save that much money. And we don't want to see mass evictions when the emergency orders are over. In California, we also successfully got the governor and philanthropy to work together to create a $125 million emergency economic aid fund for undocumented immigrants. Those include $500 one-time payments to individuals and $1,000 payments to families. It's a good first step, and it's also not systemic, and it'll barely cover half the rent, if that, for many of our families. So that's why we're looking also to the mid and long-term kind of solutions you see on your screen. Next slide, Chris. So I think this maybe goes into kind of part of the other question you had, Chris, which is about, like, so concretely, what does this mean for what people in congregations, institutions we work with are doing? And we think there's kind of three things we need to be doing concurrently. One is connect, two is learn, and three is act. Connecting refers to the need we have to weave together people who are otherwise physically distanced and out of relationship, but hungry to make meaning of what's happening in our world, hungry to share their story, to not feel so isolated. And so we're doing a lot to help people virtually, over the phone, share their stories, pray together, talk about what's going on in the world. Our goal is to have 50,000 conversations by September 1st. Through a number of kind of means. Some of those include our what we're calling belong circles, which I can share more about in another conversation. And it's also about story collection, identifying the stories of people who are hurting in particular, who then sort of speak to the need for the big systemic change that we're asking for to be accelerated through this crisis. Secondly, around learning, we are taking those stories and the people we're connecting with and asking them to step into the public square by engaging with elected officials, by engaging with people from the private sector, business leaders, and discussing real solutions that need to be implemented now to preserve human life, but then long-term to create a new social contract for our states and for our country. And so we're doing virtual town halls and what we call research meetings and trainings for people we've been connecting with. Our goal is to have met with every state and federal representative where we're organizing, as well as with the governor. And we're doing this in coordination with some of our strategic partners. And then in terms of acting, our goal is to ID supporters of some of our local campaigns around schools and communities first and census. And then during strategic moments to take action. And right now that's looked like some of these town halls. It's looked like call-in days to the state legislature or to the governor. But in the future, as we're less and less kind of, physically isolated and we're able to venture out, we might do prayer circles. We might hold each other around a circle, maybe with still safe physical distancing, but around our state legislatures. Like, imagine if we had vigils around our capitals, around our city halls, while the budget is being negotiated and decisions are being made about what to cut, who that's going to affect, and whether or not we should raise revenue. We might decide we want to accompany essential workers and frontline people going back to work, joining them as they go back to work, praying with them, and highlighting the bad conditions in terms of wages, in terms of benefits they were dealing with before this pandemic, and the need to take care of them during and after this pandemic. All the while, you'll see kind of at the baseline of this, the data collection and list building aspect. This is really critical. Every person you're connecting with, every person we're talking with about the census or our campaigns, we need to be capturing in a database. And we need to be able to communicate with them to inform them of future opportunities to get involved in the future. I think there might be one more slide, Chris. I actually won't go over this. This is just more to give you a sense of our timeline. We actually do have a sense of like when the state budget is being negotiated. On the 14th of May, there's going to be a revision that's going to show the budget shortfall. And that's going to be a key moment for action. So I'll stop there. I know we just have a couple minutes left, but I hope that's helpful.
That was great. Thanks so much for concisely bringing that all together. As you've engaged in this work over the past two months or so, I guess maybe in California it's even stretched a little bit farther. What has been the greatest challenge, and what has surprised you the most?
I just think the challenge is not being able to sort of sit with people physically and kind of build relationships in the way that we are used to. Not everyone in our communities has a laptop or a phone with a camera who can get on Zoom and join in the way that we're able to join today in these kinds of conversations. So that's been a big challenge. But I have been hopeful that collectively we can shape the story about what's happening towards belongingness and love and interdependence. We can't allow for some of the forces in our country to promote a narrative that says we got to get back to normal, or we have to lock down our borders, or government is evil and they're fascist for forcing us to be locked down in this way. We have to help redefine what an essential worker is. We have to lift up stories that show how our destinies and our well-being are intimately connected. And we have to show the ways in which government provides a critical backstop in helping us survive crises like this pandemic, as well as thrive together in good times. So that's, I think, some of what I'm hopeful for as well.
Sure. And what ways have you found to be effective in terms of connecting people across faith communities, across denominations, congregations? What have been effective strategies for making people feel more connected? Because I think there is an element of this when you feel like you're part of something, when you feel like you're working as a community, that it gives you energy. It gives you a sense of hope that collectively you can do something. So what have you found that's been effective in that way?
Yeah, well, I mentioned belong circles earlier in the discussion. that is focused on providing folks with a structure for having conversations across difference, across faith tradition, across geography. But it could also be used even within your congregation or your Jesuit work or ministry. And the idea is really to get people kind of going deeper, not just answering the question, how are you doing? But answering questions like, how, in what ways is this pandemic inviting us to change, along with the ways in which it's changing our world? And inviting us into some guided meditation and reflection and prayer together. And then also into some popular education that is about developing a more robust understanding of the competing narratives that are working to define what this moment is about, to understand some of what I shared earlier, who's making decisions about what the future will look like, who has power, and then also providing folks with a sense of what they can do, because a lot of people want to do something. They just don't necessarily know what to do. And so creating lots of moments where we're joining together for town hall forums, where we're doing call-in days to our state legislators. We're just trying to make sure that as we have these belong circles, there's always a next step. There's always an activity to invite people into.
That's great. And really quickly, before we finish up, you mentioned Pope Francis and his letter issued to the popular movements on Easter Sunday around the universal basic wage.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I've heard you speak before. You talk about Pope Francis a lot. And of course, within the Jesuit Ignatian world, people find a lot of motivation from Pope Francis. Is there anything that Pope Francis has shared that you feel, or anything just not even recently, but over time, do you feel really gives you, is applicable, or you think has real resonance with what we're experiencing right now?
Yeah, in that letter to popular movements, which I hope all of you have had a chance to read, because it's addressed to you. It's not addressed to politicians. It's not addressed to business leaders. It's addressed to people who every day want to accompany each other towards a different future. And in that letter, the Pope writes a couple lines that I've gone back to often in the last few weeks. He says, I hope that in this time of danger, we will be freed from operating on automatic pilot, shake our sleepy consciences, and allow a humanist and ecological conversion that puts an end to the idolatry of money and places human life and dignity at the center. Our civilization, so competitive, so individualistic, with its frenetic rhythms of production and consumption, its extravagant luxuries, its disproportionate profits for just a few, needs to downshift, take stock, and renew itself. And I have just found that to be such a prophetic invitation for each of us to really dream big and imagine what the world must become, and also who we must become, in service to a different kind of future. And I just believe that as Jesuits, as people of faith, we have a unique role to play in being that prophetic kind of voice and echoing that spirit and energy that Pope Francis offered to us on Easter Sunday.
That's great. Well, Joseph, thanks so much for being with us today and offering us some sustenance as we begin this chance to talk more in depth about the issues that our communities across the country face and the ways we might address them. We really appreciate both the kind of theoretical but the more concrete of the work of Pico, California that's happening across the state there. So thanks so much for being with us today. We're really grateful for your presence.
All right, you're welcome. Thank you, Chris. Great to be with you all. Even though I can't see you, I know you're out there.
They're there. So, trust me, they're
God
there.
Bless.
All right. All right. We're going to transition now to kind of an example of concrete action that's happening at Brophy College Preparatory School. And we're going to welcome Victor Cervantes, who's a faculty member there, and a student, Brian Molina, to share some of the work that they're doing engaging the issue of immigration on their campus. So we're going to welcome Brian and Victor. And guys, we're going to turn it over to you. Victor, I think you have some slides that you're going to share, so we'll bring those into the screen as well. And we're going to turn it over to you here in a second once those slides get loaded up to have about 10 minutes to share the work that's happening there at Brophy. All right?
Thank you so much, Chris. Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Victor Cervantes. I am an English teacher and part of the English department at Brophy College Prep. And for those that are unaware, Brophy College Prep is in Phoenix, Arizona. We have around 1,400 students. It's a single-sex male school. And we strive to have the same diversity on campus as shown throughout Maricopa County. So myself and Brian are part of the Advocacy Club, the Brophy Xavier Advocacy Club, in conjunction with Xavier College Prep, where we invite students from Xavier College Prep to be a part of our efforts and be a part of the leadership board and to move the dial forward. So today we are going to be focusing in on one of our campaigns for immigrant justice. But to give you a little bit of background on the Advocacy Club, if you would like to follow along on a separate tab, you can follow along at bit.ly/advocacy club, and you will find our newly formed and created website, which Brian Islava Molina, who is a senior, will talk about a little bit further in a little bit. So to give you a sense of how we've approached our work, we really have taken a strategic planning approach of, okay, we are a well of collective observations and emotions of people who are directly impacted by injustices, and also individuals who have such deep love for individuals and for communities who are directly impacted by injustices. So with this well, what are we seeking to do, or how do we want individuals to be part of this journey, be part of this path? So we really approached it through a traditional strategic planning path, which is that of a MOSA, or vision, mission, objectives, strategies, and action plans. And first and foremost, our vision is to fight for justice, equality, solidarity for those and with those whose voices are silenced. But what does that actually mean for high school students in particular in Central Phoenix? Well, that's where our mission comes into play. So we are an empowered community of young people guided by our Catholic faith in particular. And what is very special about this community and this club in particular is that it actually does act as a hub for different collaboration from different individuals with different faith backgrounds. So we are working through a broad platform of community organizing, lobbying, and activist education in order to achieve justice and a more equal world. So what does that mean in terms of action? So we really do stand on these four pillars, or these four active pathways, which is first, creating a platform to share stories, which is connected to Joseph and Pico, California's mission of sharing storytelling. This was even before I came onto campus. As a faculty member and as a part of Advocacy Club, was students who wanted to just share their stories as being individuals directly impacted by certain injustices when it comes to immigration and migration. Then identifying these structures of injustices and educating others, and really seeing how change could occur both as a high school student or as an adult within the community in order to address these injustices. Next, aiming to fundamentally change the environment around us. So that in particular is through one-on-one, face-to-face conversation, and then more directly through activism, whether it be speaking with our administration for certain policy changes, or going to the state capitol and the state legislature to have conversations with our representatives and our state senators on how to better serve those communities that are facing these deep injustices. And then most importantly, what we have found is that, especially with the universal apostolic preferences, we now have a calling, a vocation forward that really we can utilize in order to connect with individuals who might not have heard this message earlier because it may seem too political, or it may seem to insert the adjective that you would like to insert at this moment. But really, it's our Catholic tradition that is leading us forward, and especially now with the universal apostolic preferences. So for us, in a concrete manner, this has meant the creation and activation of 3 campaigns. The Dream On campaign for immigrant and migration justice, Hope for Hospitality, and environmental advocacy. And Hope for Hospitality is advocacy for those who are currently experiencing homelessness. And environmental advocacy focuses on our call to create a better world, a better home for us all. So specifically, we will be speaking on the Dream On campaign today, which Brian can elaborate on.
So good afternoon. As Mr. Victor mentioned, I am a senior at Brophy College Preparatory, and I am also a member of the Advocacy Club. And so one of the campaigns of the Brophy Xavier Advocacy Club is the Dream On campaign, which was created in response to the rescinding of DACA back when it was, rescinded by the Trump administration. And so students who were directly impacted by this decision decided that they wanted to share their stories in front of the community, and they wanted to let their, invite people to see them face to face and get to know who they are. And so that led to the creation of the Dream On campaign. And since then, we've been striving towards, working towards immigration justice. And that's taken on the form of partnerships with different communities, such as Aliento. And that's also taking on it's taking the form of different events, such as raising awareness, that strive to raise awareness on issues related to immigration. So a teach-in kind of thing where, again, students share their personal experience on being impacted by this decision. And also that's a way of uplifting their voice and, letting them have their voices heard by the rest of the community. And also another event that the Brophy Xavier Advocacy Club has participated is Education Day, where 300 students from 30 different high schools gather at the Arizona State Capitol and advocate for access to in-state tuition for all Arizona high school graduates, regardless of immigration status. And that's how we've engaged in legislative actions. And so we are, in an ideal world, we plan to continue these events physically. But because of the situation and the circumstances that we find ourselves in, we were invited to transition it to a online platform. And so as Mr. Victor said, that we created a website where it serves as an extension of our work and a place where people can get involved and see what the Advocacy Club is up to. And so kind of the format of the website is that at the very top you can find links to any direct action that people can take. So one of them is signing a petition to include families on stimulus packages, and another one is donating to a relief fund created by Aliento that strives to help families who were not benefited by the stimulus checks. And they also have there's also links to news, such as like anything. There's news that relating to anything of immigration. Sorry, and so let's say there's a update on the DACA's hearings in the Supreme Court, like that. We will feature that on the website. And then there's also we're in the process of creating a podcast for the website where we strive to simulate the idea of like sharing your stories, whether it be through a video or whether it be through a microphone, whether it be through a screen. And so the main purpose of the website again is to engage people and let people know that, you know, we're still working on what we were, even if it's on a digital platform.
So yes, to build off of what Brian was saying, you know, one of our key tenets is still to continue building relationships. So we are not working in a siloed, isolated environment. And so that's why we work specifically with Aliento, who is an organization located here in Maricopa County that really helps mixed status families and individuals who are undocumented and DACA students. And something that we've learned in making our campaigns go online is that we, all of us cohesively and collectively are the audience that we are attempting to reach. And so in trying to build these relationships, as long as we are keeping our values strong, and as long as we are uplifting those values, then we will reach the individuals that we would like to reach in a completely different fashion because of the current circumstances that we are in. So an example that we have of taking to the online platform is we would like to share this video with you all.
Girl, you have done it again. Constantly raising the bar for us all and doing it flawlessly. I'd say I'm surprised, but I know who you are. I've seen it up close and personal. Girl, you make me so proud. And I love you. I'm a savage, yeah. Classy, bougie, sassy.
So what is really special about going to an online platform, whether it be the website, now the creation of Instagram accounts and Twitter accounts for the Advocacy Club, is that we can respond in real time or in a quicker manner, more so than creating physical events. So therefore responding, as Brian had said, to the Supreme Court decision of DACA or to definitions as put out by the government of essential workers, as mentioned by Joseph from Pico, we can more easily and successfully in certain ways respond to these times in order to, again, build these relationships, uplift voices, educate the communities that aren't necessarily hearing the messaging that needs to be heard. And so we continue to ask ourselves these three questions. What do we value? What are our interests? And what platforms do we already use? There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Yes, we have different tools accessible to us rather than being in a room with 30 bodies exchanging ideas, but rather, okay, if our values remain consistent, how can we continue to look at these values and reshape them into the existing platforms that we're already using to communicate? We're already utilizing the interest that we have. So some of the ideas that we are currently percolating, Brian, would you like to take it away?
So I'd safe to say that everyone in high school is on social media. So we've been using social media pretty extensively to kind of advertise the website that we have just created. And it's also going to serve as a way of, engaging our peers directly, since, it's easier to click on someone's profile or someone's story that they shared on their social media. And so some of the ideas that we've come up with is, in the future, we plan to have like a video series where we just recap all the events that we have done in the past, kind of as a digital journal in a way, write down our reactions and feelings to what the work that we have been doing. And there's also ideas to create theme weeks. So one of the weeks is like policy week, and we just post posts that are related to policies that are connected with the 3 campaigns. So, for example, one of them could be the decision to end DACA and the DACA hearings, and locally SB 1070 and Prop 300, which limit students from, pursuing higher education.
And so similar to that video, a lot of the media that we are starting to distribute and share is media such as this Instagram post, which is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Center for American Progress, that, okay, we are striving towards reaching out to our immigrant and migrant communities and also uplifting their voices, that 27 to now an estimated 29,000 of frontline workers are DACA recipients. That, in line with our campaign, the Dream On campaign, they are interconnected. So therefore, how can we respond to the current time and still, again, hold our messaging and our values as clear and consistent as possible to continue to uplift these voices and education? And from the moderator standpoint, I'm not alone. So I'm a co-moderator with Mr. William Rutt, who is in our religious department, Marcos Gonzalez, who is our director of equity and inclusion at Brophy, and Sue Hornbeck, who is part of our Office of Faith and Justice. The 4 of us collectively really respond to this quote, that if our pedagogy doesn't require us to ask young people questions and to hear and value their stories, then we are not partners in the educational process. This is called indoctrination, not education. So what we really strive to remind ourselves is that although we might have certain ways of doing things, our students are actually the ones who are implementing, executing, creating, developing all of these campaigns and all of these strategies for communication, education, advocacy, and for enacting and creating all of this change. So as long as we are really honing in on their ideas and uplifting them, that is where true change will be seen and heard.
Excellent. Thank you so much to Brian and Victor for
which then leads us to the challenge that we see.
Go ahead, Victor. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say the challenge that we have for all of us is, what do we hear and see from our communities, and how can we really uplift all of that? So thank you so much to all of you for including us in today's workshop.
And thank you for these contributions and for sharing your work and your story, Brian and Victor, and for for carrying on this initiative in the midst of this crisis, right? And for recognizing the importance of sustaining this commitment despite the realities of the pandemic in your community. So really grateful for your time today. Thanks for joining us. All right, we're gonna turn things over to Father Ted Penton, who's the Secretary for Justice and Ecology at the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the United States. And Father Penton is going to share very briefly a little bit of the work that the Jesuit Conference has been doing, seeking to call attention to key policy areas as they relate to federal legislation to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. So, Father Ted, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then we'll get your slides up here in 1 second, okay?
Great. Thanks very much, Chris. It's lovely to be here with you and with so many from around our Ignatian family across the country today. As Chris said, I lead the Office of Justice and Ecology for the Jesuit Conference here in DC, and we're the federal advocacy voice for the Jesuits. We work closely with partners like ISN and many, many others across our Jesuit networks, guided by Ignatian spirituality, guided by our Catholic social tradition of seeking the common good, of walking in solidarity with one another, and particularly the preferential option for the poor, for those on the margins. Those are the voices that we're trying to magnify and elevate in our work. As you all know, there's been a lot of federal activity legislatively related to the pandemic. The most important package being the CARES Act, which went through at the end of March, and which included some very important provisions, including the $1,200 relief checks, the $600 monthly top-up for people receiving UI. As Brian noted just earlier, of course, not everybody benefits from these, but they are important, but they are incomplete, and there was a lot missing from this package. There's a lot of interest. Certainly, we're doing what we can to push for additional relief packages at the federal level to help fill in some of these really large gaps that there are in the federal response to date. Currently, things are somewhat bogged down, with the Democrats in particular pushing for significant additional funding, including support for state and local governments, while Republicans, in particular in the Senate, at this stage seem not to be willing to approve large new funding, are starting to raise concerns around the deficit. So the negotiations will undoubtedly be a little more protracted before we see another significant bill going through, but we're doing what we can to kind of prepare for that and push for the provisions that we think are most important to our communities. Next slide, Chris. So our office focuses on these four main policy areas, and we'll sort of review them one by one as far as what we see as being the key elements needed for additional relief. But the overall theme, harkening back to what Joseph was saying earlier, is that really this pandemic is shedding a lot of light on the many injustices that have long been present in our society. It's shedding light on them, on the ways that people suffer, but it's also exacerbating them. The people who are already suffering most are also the groups that are most vulnerable in this time of pandemic. And we'll go through those, at least the ones that our office works most closely with. Next slide, please. So in the area of migration, there's a significant two in particular areas of concern. One is around access to healthcare. And this for a lot of people, though there are a lot of people in immigration detention, which is a very unhealthy place to be right now. In those close quarters, you can't do the social distancing you need. But also for people, migrants who are in our communities, concerns around seeking healthcare. First of all, we'd like to see a prohibition on any ICE enforcement at places where people need to be, going to healthcare facilities in those sort of community areas where people need to be for their own health. There should be no deterrence for them going there, as well as financial assistance. The COVID testing treatment needs to be made available to everybody in this country for the good of us all, regardless of what immigration status anybody has. And as well, as far as recovering and dealing with the financial fallout, most undocumented, certainly many, if not most undocumented people in this country pay taxes, but don't have eligibility currently for most of the benefits that are coming through. So we would ask that the Social Security number requirement be removed for people receiving assistance, and that all people who have a taxpayer identification number be eligible for that assistance. And next slide. On the economic justice, again, the light here is that so much of our economy is based on low wage, low benefit work to begin with benefits being tied to employment, So those who are unemployed don't have that access to health care. Many people who are employed don't have access to good health care. Many of these jobs have poor benefits. And again, as Joseph was saying, it's the low-wage workers who are most of the most essential workers, the ones doing the most crucial jobs right now, keeping our society going, harvesting our food, stocking our grocery shelves, preparing meals, delivering meals. So a lot of our asks at the federal level are related to that, ensuring that people have paid sick leave so they can stay home when they need to. We're asking for increased SNAP benefits for people who are hungry, need assistance in purchasing food. Asking for additional assistance for those who are homeless, those who are having trouble paying their rent, having emergency rental assistance. Next slide, please. Another significant group that's in great risk is those in our criminal justice system. Again, as with those in immigration detention, very difficult, impossible really to socially distance in the way that's necessary. So very vulnerable places as far as contracting the COVID-19. There has been some progress in the initial CARES Act, but a lot more is needed. So there was some progress, for instance, in opening up compassionate early release for a larger number of people. We think this is especially important for those who are elderly, for those who are ill, for people who are nearing their release date anyways. Unfortunately, the Attorney General, in implementing some of what Congress put out, has put a number of additional hurdles in place, such as a 60-day waiting period in order to apply for compassionate release, restricting it to people accused of or convicted of certain crimes and over a certain age. So we would continue to ask for more to be done here to ensure that as many people as possible can be released in a way that is, of course, safe. Those who are not a continuing risk to our society, so that they can be released and find safer conditions outside of confinement. And a significant piece that's connected to that is access to social benefits. Unfortunately, many people after being released from incarceration don't have the same level of access to food and housing benefits as others. And those are particularly important now in this time of pandemic, although of course always important. And we would ask also for greater communication access for those who are incarcerated. Again, there's been some movement forward on this point, but we would ask for a lot more, especially for more digital video conference type access. Most prisons now, there's no in-person visits that are permitted anymore. So just to allow people to have that connection with their loved ones at this time. On the environmental justice piece, it's many of our poorest communities, the rural communities, communities of color, indigenous communities, that have the worst underlying health conditions to begin with. Often this is because these are communities that are more exposed to pollution. They have less access to healthcare services. So these are the communities that need to be given the most funding, to receive targeted funding in order to deal with the current crisis. Everybody needs access to utilities. We'd ask for a moratorium on cutting off people's utilities at this time. How do you wash your hands if your water's not running? And then this moves to that sort of longer looking forward piece, which is around the infrastructure investment that's needed. This pandemic does present an opportunity of a sort to really invest in our future, to invest in the green technologies that will mitigate climate change, other health risks, the pollution risks that are leaving people with respiratory conditions in greater vulnerability now. And also a chance to invest in those communities that are in greater need of economic growth. So these are a number of the asks that we've been putting out and will continue to put out federally. You can find on the ISN website or on our own website, we've put out an action alert. Most of these asks are listed there. This is an easy way to share these asks with your own members of Congress. And on both the ISN page and our page, you can also find a number of related resources to give more background information And as always, we also encourage you to make calls, schedule virtual meetings with your members of Congress, in addition to sending out those emails.
Great. Father Ted, thanks so much for that very, very quick overview. That was wonderful and so efficient and but yet concise. Really appreciate the work that the Jesuit Conference's Office of Justice and Ecology is doing on these issues. And in the wake of this crisis, it was also exciting to hear both references to Pope Francis as well as the universal apostolic preferences during the earlier presentations as well, which certainly are having a strong influence of the work of the Jesuits here in the United States and Canada throughout the conference. So thanks so much for this and for being with us today. And we're gonna say goodbye to you and get ready to jump into into our breakout session. So thank you.
Great, you're very welcome. Thanks very much to you, Chris, and thanks to all those who are joining us who've been engaged in so much advocacy on these issues already. We really appreciate that.
Excellent. All right, so it's time to make this transition to our breakout sessions. I noticed that many of you have already, you're on Zoom. You've been placed in your breakout room. How this is going to work is that we've got about 20 minutes or so for discussion. We're going to come back at 25 after the hour. So that would be 4:25 Eastern, 3:25 Central, 2:25 Mountain, and 1:25 Pacific. Okay. When you're in your room with folks, you're going to introduce yourself, your first name, where you live, city, state, what institution, school, parish, etc. You can do that in the chat so that people can see your names in case they forget who you are, but also if you want to do it quickly verbally as well to make that visual connection. And then we're going to ask that the person whose name falls first alphabetically, their first name falls first alphabetically, just to kind of try to facilitate the questions, all right? So guide folks through the questions. If you're really uncomfortable with this, if you hate facilitation, if you have an anti-facilitation clause in your contract or something like that, you can pass the buck, but hopefully you won't, okay? And then finally, if the last person alphabetically by first name can just take a second towards the end of your session to fill out the form that's linked there on the web page. You'll see down at the bottom, it's a link. It's a Google form, and it will help us to be able to quickly reflect back when we regather, all right, at the end of the session for a few minutes. So if you can fill that out, it'll also give us a better sense of what you're talking about and thinking about to aid our work at the Ignatian Solidarity Network. There are four discussion questions, all right? They're at the bottom of the page there where it says discussion questions. So I'd ask you to talk about those briefly. If you are in the Zoom room but not in a room yet, we'll place you in a room, okay? Here in a second. Just so thanks for being patient with that. And I'm going to send you a few of you a message because it's unclear by your name who you are. So we'll figure out who you are and get you into the right room. But if you're in the right place, feel free to jump into discussion right now, and we'll gather back here in a little bit at 25 after the hour. Okay. So we'll see you very soon. All right. Thanks. All right. Welcome back to everyone who's joining us. Thanks for taking time to speak in groups. I know that for some of you, you got into the groups a little bit late, so the conversation was a little bit truncated, but hopefully you got a chance to at least connect with some real human beings, maybe from very close by, or in some cases kind of regionally. We want to take a look, just take a second just to see some of the things that people are sharing as responses to their experience. And so we'll put those up there in a minute, but really quickly, one of the things that we found really important out of Joseph's presentation was the connection or connectivity to the realities and communities, and really finding ways to ground our work in communities, and then to think creatively about how we can unite, whether it's through technology or hopefully for many of our communities in some capacity in a more in-person reality, even if it's from a social distance, right? So let's take a look at some of what people are sharing. You can also see this in your own browser if you were the one to submit the information. But I'll just post up here some of what we're seeing as responses. In terms of key issues, the situation of immigrant communities was a big one. Wages, food insecurity, rent moratorium. Are some food insecurity again is one that's mentioned by folks. Who's doing a good job of bringing attention to these issues, inviting people into action, etc. Some people cited government officials like governor's updates, state representatives, faith communities like Holy Trinity there in Washington, D.C., community organizations, though they mentioned not the universities. So that's an interesting point. How could the skills and perspectives shared during today's workshop be useful in responding to the realities facing your communities? Folks shared it would be good to have one voice instead of so much info from multiple organizations coming together in a helpful way. One of the challenges, of course, is that the organizations listed cover a wide range of issues and don't necessarily always coalesce around just one thing. To listen to our communities is a good point. And then someone talked about the framework offered by Joseph McKellar was excellent in terms of connecting broken systems to what is happening today, the need to see we are all connected, and three-pronged framework. And we'll make sure that those slides are available on the resource section of the page. Somebody cited Brophy's website and the resources to help around or community partners as well. And just kind of going back to the top in terms of other issue areas that were mentioned. Food insecurity seems to be one that consistently is coming up as an example of a common issue. Incarceration, the situation of the homeless, ICE detention, again. So a lot of commonalities. We will also share out this document so that you can take a look at what people are sharing from other parts of the country. I want to bring your attention to one of the resources that's on the resource page right now. It's a great document that takes a look at how to engage with congressional members and in terms of both whether it's to engage with federal congressional members, U.S. Congress members, either on the Hill or in district, and has some steps to create a virtual meeting or a virtual Hill Day, virtual Advocacy Day. ISN will actually be facilitating a day like this for Jesuit parishes in June, in late June. So we can make sure that you get information about that And of course, we have the advocacy alert that Father Penton mentioned, which was issued by the Jesuit Conference, as well as the Jesuit Conference Office of Justice and Ecology, as well as ISN. I realize our time is coming to the end, and so one of the things that we recognize about trying to gather people for something a little bit more substantial is that our time is still very limited. And we'll send out a survey about what you found valuable of today, what you would like to have more of, what elements would be more beneficial, whether it's skill building, knowledge, theoretical knowledge, issue, context, and things like that, because we'd really like to see this as kind of just an initial step in trying to provide more sustenance on this topic of kind of digital advocacy and action in the context of the COVID crisis, recognizing that while there may be elements of society that become more open and available to us in the coming months, that our lives will be very different in many ways, and so we have to be creative about how we seek to address justice issues in these coming days. So I want to thank you all for being with us today. We will send out a survey in a little bit, inviting you to offer some reflections on what you found valuable in today and what you'd like to learn more about. Also, if you're not aware, we each Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, we host Solidarity on Tap, virtual Solidarity on Tap, rather than in a pub or a bar. It's online, and you can bring a drink to your computer or your TV and watch. We have Sister Helen Prejean, the well-known death penalty, anti-death penalty advocate, who will be joining us tonight for a conversation. It's about an hour, and we take questions from the audience. So if you want to share a question via social media or something like that, you're welcome to do that. And again, thank you so much for being with us. We learned a lot through this experience, and we hope that there was something within this that provides sustenance to you. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll talk. We'll see you soon. Thanks. Bye.